In this episode, we shift from managing technology resources like systems and services to managing something that is often more valuable and more dangerous at the same time: the information assets those systems hold. Beginners frequently think of data as an invisible byproduct of business, something that simply accumulates and is always useful. But in governance, information is treated like an asset with a life cycle that must be governed intentionally. If you cannot see what information exists, where it lives, how it is used, and when it should be removed, then you cannot manage its value or its risk. Value becomes invisible when data is inconsistent, poorly described, or trapped in silos, because teams cannot trust it or reuse it confidently. Risk becomes invisible when sensitive information spreads into uncontrolled places, retention drifts beyond policy, and disposal never happens, because exposure grows quietly until an incident makes it painfully obvious. Governing lifecycle management for information assets is therefore about keeping both value and risk visible over time, so leaders can make informed trade-offs and the enterprise can use information confidently without accumulating hidden liabilities. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. An information asset is any collection of information that the organization relies on to operate, decide, comply, or create value, and it can take many forms. It might be a customer data set, a set of contracts, an employee record system, financial reports, product telemetry, or analytic datasets derived from many sources. The important beginner insight is that information assets are not automatically governed just because there are systems around them, because systems can store data while still leaving meaning, ownership, quality, and retention unmanaged. Lifecycle governance for information assets begins with identifying and describing what the asset is, what purpose it serves, what data it contains, and what outcomes depend on it. This description makes value visible because it clarifies why the asset exists and how it supports decisions or operations. It also makes risk visible because it surfaces whether the asset contains sensitive data, whether it is widely shared, and whether its misuse could cause harm. Without this foundational description, information assets become anonymous piles of data, and anonymous assets cannot be governed effectively. Beginners can think of this like owning many valuables without labels or records. You might still have them, but you cannot manage them responsibly or even know which ones matter most. Governance creates that records, so lifecycle decisions are based on understanding rather than on assumption. The lifecycle of an information asset starts at creation or collection, and value and risk are shaped immediately by what is collected and how it is structured. Governance at creation focuses on purpose limitation, meaning information is collected because it supports a legitimate business need, not simply because it might be useful someday. Purpose limitation keeps risk visible because it forces the question of whether the organization is collecting more sensitive information than necessary, which increases exposure and obligations. It also keeps value visible because it encourages collecting information in a structured way that supports reuse, quality, and analytics. If data is collected inconsistently, value becomes hard to extract later because teams spend time cleaning and reconciling rather than learning and improving. Governance at creation also includes classification, because classification defines how sensitive the information is and what handling expectations apply. A common beginner misunderstanding is that classification is a security label added later, but for lifecycle governance, it is a core attribute that travels with the asset. When classification is applied early, controls can be consistent and risk can be measured across the enterprise. Once an information asset exists, value becomes visible through discoverability and meaning, which is where information architecture and metadata matter. If people cannot find an asset, cannot understand what fields mean, and cannot trust where the data came from, the asset's value is theoretical rather than real. Governance supports discoverability through inventories, catalogs, and consistent descriptions that clarify what an asset contains, who owns it, and how it should be used. Metadata, which includes definitions, lineage, and quality indicators, is what allows leaders to treat information as a governed asset rather than a rumor. Risk also becomes more visible when metadata exists because it clarifies sensitivity, access expectations, and data flows. Beginners might assume that storing data in a secure system automatically manages risk, but risk depends on how widely the asset is used and copied. When governance requires that information assets have clear descriptions and ownership, teams can reuse assets instead of creating new duplicates, and that reduces both waste and risk. Visibility here is not merely documentation for its own sake. It is a control that allows better decisions and reduces hidden duplication. Use and sharing are the lifecycle stages where risk can expand quickly and where value can either grow or be undermined. Information assets often move between systems, departments, and partners, and each movement can create new copies or new interpretations. Governance keeps value visible by enforcing consistent definitions and ensuring that derived datasets are linked back to authoritative sources so analytics do not drift into disagreement. Governance keeps risk visible by requiring that sharing patterns are controlled and that the minimum necessary data is used for a given purpose. Beginners often assume that if someone has access, they can use the data for any purpose, but lifecycle governance requires defining permissible use, because using data beyond its intended purpose can create compliance issues and trust failures. Sharing also creates a challenge for lifecycle control because a copy may persist long after the original asset is updated or retired. This is why governance emphasizes controlling exports and uncontrolled copies, because uncontrolled copies make both value and risk harder to track. When use and sharing are governed, information assets can enable innovation without turning into untraceable liabilities. Data quality is a major driver of value visibility because poor quality hides value by making outputs unreliable. If customer records are duplicated or inconsistent, leaders cannot confidently measure customer behavior, operations cannot reliably serve customers, and teams waste time fixing errors manually. Quality governance includes defining what good quality means for each asset and how quality will be monitored, because not every asset requires the same precision. Beginners sometimes assume that quality is a technical issue solved by database constraints, but quality is also a process and accountability issue, because errors often come from how data is captured and how people use systems. Governing lifecycle management means establishing stewardship responsibilities for monitoring and improving quality over time, not just fixing problems when they become painful. Quality indicators also make risk visible because poor quality can cause harmful decisions, such as misbilling or incorrect compliance reporting. When quality is measured and reported, leaders can see whether an asset is becoming more valuable or less valuable, and they can invest in improvements intentionally. This is how governance turns data quality from an endless complaint into a managed performance dimension. Value becomes visible when quality is visible. Retention and archival are lifecycle stages that strongly influence both value and risk, because keeping data longer can preserve evidence and enable long-term analysis, but it can also increase exposure. Governance must define retention rules by asset type, balancing legal requirements, business needs, and risk tolerance. Beginners often fall into the extremes of keep everything forever or delete everything quickly, but lifecycle governance avoids extremes by applying purpose-based retention, meaning data is kept as long as it is needed for its legitimate purpose and obligations, and no longer. Archival can preserve value while reducing risk by moving inactive data into controlled storage that is less exposed to daily access. However, archiving without governance can hide risk, because archived data can become a dark corner where sensitive information persists without oversight. Governing archival means keeping visibility of what is archived, what controls apply, and when it will be disposed of. Retention visibility also supports cost management because storing and protecting vast amounts of data consumes resources, even when the data is not actively used. When retention is governed, leaders can see the trade-off between long-term analytic value and risk exposure clearly. That clarity supports better decisions and reduces surprise. Secure disposal is the lifecycle stage that often exposes whether governance is real, because disposal requires discipline, coordination, and evidence. If an organization cannot reliably dispose of information assets that should no longer exist, risk stays hidden until a breach, an audit, or a privacy request reveals the gap. Secure disposal is also tied to value visibility because data that should have been removed can contaminate analytics, create confusion about what is current, and increase the burden of responding to requests and investigations. Governance must ensure disposal is possible in practice, meaning the organization understands where copies exist, how backups and replicas are handled, and how disposal is verified. Beginners might assume deletion is simple, but in enterprise environments, data can persist across multiple systems, logs, and archives, and disposal must account for those realities. A governance-driven disposal process includes ownership, schedules tied to retention rules, and checks that confirm data was removed as intended. It also includes exception management for cases where data must be retained longer due to legal holds or ongoing disputes. When disposal is governed, risk decreases steadily rather than accumulating silently, and leaders can trust that lifecycle rules are not merely words. Keeping value and risk visible also requires reporting and governance oversight, because visibility fades if no one reviews it. Governance should define what leaders need to see about information assets, such as which assets are most critical, which assets contain the most sensitive data, which assets have quality issues, and which assets have retention or disposal noncompliance. Reporting should be understandable to leaders, using outcome language like exposure, reliability of reporting, and compliance posture rather than technical jargon. Beginners might wonder why leaders need this, and the answer is that leaders must make trade-offs, such as whether to invest in improving data quality, whether to consolidate data platforms, or whether to accelerate disposal efforts to reduce risk. Without visibility, these trade-offs are made based on anecdotes, and investments can miss the true problem. Reporting should also reveal trends, because trends show whether governance is improving the environment or whether risk is drifting upward. When leaders can see trends, they can hold the organization accountable and allocate resources effectively. Visibility without governance action is just information, but visibility with action is risk and value management. Another way governance sustains visibility is by integrating lifecycle controls into everyday processes, so visibility is maintained by normal work rather than by occasional audits. For example, when new information assets are created, governance can require that ownership, classification, and retention expectations are defined before the asset is widely used. When assets are modified, governance can require that changes to definitions and flows are documented so downstream users are not surprised. When assets are shared with third parties, governance can require that data handling obligations are clear and that risk assessments are updated. Beginners often assume governance is a separate activity, but lifecycle governance works best when it is embedded. Embedding reduces the chance that assets become invisible over time because the processes that create and change assets also update the governance view. This is also how governance becomes scalable, because the enterprise cannot rely on a small central group to track everything manually. When lifecycle governance is embedded, the organization builds an environment where value and risk remain visible as a side effect of disciplined operations. That is a hallmark of mature governance. Finally, lifecycle governance for information assets must address cultural behavior, because people can easily create shadow data stores when official pathways feel slow or inconvenient. Shadow data stores often destroy visibility because they create uncontrolled copies that bypass classification, retention, and disposal expectations. Governance keeps value visible by making official data sources easier to use and more trustworthy, reducing the incentive to build private datasets. It keeps risk visible by enforcing clear rules about where sensitive data can be stored and by educating people on why uncontrolled copies create exposure. Beginners should understand that people usually create workarounds to get work done, not to create risk, which is why governance should focus on making safe behavior easy. When governance controls are practical and well communicated, the organization can maintain visibility without constant enforcement. When controls are unrealistic, people will bypass them and visibility will collapse. A mature lifecycle governance approach, therefore, combines clear rules with supportive systems and communication, so people do not feel trapped into unsafe shortcuts. This human-centered approach is essential for keeping both value and risk visible. As we close, governing lifecycle management for information assets so value and risk stay visible means treating information as a managed asset with clear ownership, clear meaning, and clear lifecycle controls from creation to disposal. Value stays visible when information assets are discoverable, well-defined, high quality, and linked to business outcomes, so leaders and teams can trust and reuse data confidently. Risk stays visible when classification, sharing controls, retention rules, archival discipline, and secure disposal are applied consistently, so sensitive data does not spread silently or persist beyond its permitted life. Visibility is sustained through reporting, measurement, and embedding lifecycle controls into everyday processes rather than relying on occasional cleanup efforts. For brand new learners, the key takeaway is that information becomes dangerous and wasteful when it becomes invisible, because invisible data cannot be governed. When governance keeps value and risk visible, the enterprise can make better decisions, reduce exposure, and build confidence that information is being handled responsibly over time. That is how lifecycle governance turns data from an uncontrolled accumulation into a strategic asset with managed risk.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.